In just 47 minutes, the entire European security architecture trembled. Giorgia Meloni didn't consult Brussels. She didn't wait for NATO approval. She picked up the secure line and dialed Moscow directly. The cameras at the G7 summit captured the exact moment when European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's face went pale. What did the Italian Prime Minister discuss with Vladimir Putin that sent shockwaves through the corridors of power from Berlin to Washington? The call happened at exactly 2:17 p.m. Rome time. While European leaders were still debating the next round of sanctions in their closed-door session, Meloni stepped away from the conference table. Security footage shows her walking briskly to a secure communication room, her chief of staff trailing behind with a thick dossier marked Energy Emergency Protocol. What the other leaders didn't know was that this wasn't a spontaneous decision. This was a calculated diplomatic gamble that had been months in the making. The conversation lasted exactly 23 minutes and 14 seconds. Intelligence sources confirmed that the call was monitored by at least 4 different agencies, including the NSA, GCHQ, and the BND. The transcript remains classified, but leaked fragments paint a picture of a conversation that went far beyond the expected diplomatic pleasantries. According to these sources, Putin's tone was described as surprisingly accommodating, while Meloni remained coldly professional throughout. The most shocking revelation came in minute 18 when intercepted communications suggested discussion of specific gas volumes and pricing mechanisms that would undercut current European suppliers. Meloni wasn't just talking to Putin about energy supplies. She was negotiating what insiders are calling the Rome Arrangement, a secret framework that could fundamentally reshape Europe's relationship with Russia. The first indication that something seismic had occurred came from the body language in the conference room. When Meloni returned to her seat, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. French President Emmanuel Macron was seen frantically checking his phone. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz appeared visibly agitated, repeatedly adjusting his glasses, a telltale sign of stress that his aides know all too well. Von der Leyen sat motionless, her usually composed demeanor cracking under the weight of what she had just learned through back channels. The specific trigger for Brussels' panic wasn't just the fact that the call happened, it was the timing. European intelligence had intercepted communications suggesting that Putin had been waiting for this exact moment, when EU solidarity was at its most fragile, when energy prices were crushing Italian households, and when Meloni's domestic approval ratings gave her the political capital to take unprecedented risks. The Russian president had been patient, calculating, and now he was cashing in. Within minutes of the call ending, the European Council's emergency hotline was buzzing. Von der Leyen's office immediately summoned Meloni for what sources described as an urgent clarification meeting. The Italian delegation's response was swift and uncompromising. They refused to provide a detailed briefing, citing national sovereignty and the complexity of Italy's energy security situation. This wasn't defiance. This was a declaration of independence from Brussels' micromanagement. The financial implications became apparent almost immediately. European gas futures spiked by 12% within the hour as traders interpreted the mystery call as a sign of potential cracks in the sanctions regime. The euro dropped 0.3% against the dollar, a seemingly small movement that represented billions in market capitalization disappearing into thin air. Italian government bonds actually strengthened by 15 basis points as investors began pricing in reduced energy costs for the Italian economy. Meanwhile, German energy giant Uniper saw its shares plummet by 8% as markets speculated about potential competitive disadvantages. Energy analysts began frantically recalculating their models, trying to factor in a scenario they had never seriously considered: a major EU member state pursuing bilateral energy deals outside the bloc's framework. But the real bombshell came later that evening. At 7:45 p.m., Italian state television leaked details of what they called preliminary agreements on humanitarian energy corridors. The terminology was deliberately vague, but energy experts immediately understood the implications. Meloni had potentially negotiated a mechanism for Italy to receive Russian gas through alternative routes, bypassing both EU oversight and existing sanctions architecture. If true, this wasn't just a diplomatic coup, it was a fundamental challenge to European unity. The Brussels establishment's response was immediate and vicious. Anonymous briefings to major European newspapers painted Meloni as a Putin sympathizer who had betrayed European values. The attacks weren't just political, they were personal. Sources close to von der Leyen's office described the Italian leader as dangerously naive and suggested that Rome's actions bordered on institutional treason. Behind closed doors, Commission officials were reportedly using far harsher language, with one senior advisor allegedly calling Meloni's move the death of European solidarity. Emergency consultations with Washington began within hours as Brussels desperately sought American backing for a potential punitive response. The gloves were off, and the EU elite was preparing for war. Meloni's counterattack was swift and devastating. At a hastily arranged press conference in Rome, she stood at the podium with the confidence of someone who held all the cards. Her opening statement was just 47 words, but each one was carefully chosen for maximum impact. Italy's energy security is non-negotiable. Our citizens will not freeze to satisfy Brussels' ideological fantasies. We have explored all available options to ensure reliable, affordable energy for Italian families and businesses. The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions about sanctions violations, but Meloni remained calm, almost serene. When pressed about the details of her conversation with Putin, her response sent chills through European capitals. I discussed what any responsible leader would discuss, the welfare of their people. If Brussels has a better solution for Italy's energy crisis, I'm listening. Until then, Rome will pursue all legal avenues to secure our national interests. The legal qualifier wasn't accidental. Italian government lawyers had spent weeks crafting a framework that would allow bilateral energy agreements while technically remaining within EU law. The mechanism relied on Article 122 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which permits member states to take emergency measures in cases of severe difficulties in energy supply. Meloni's team had found a loophole, and they were driving a gas pipeline through it. The geopolitical ramifications were immediate and far-reaching. Washington's reaction was swift and unforgiving. State Department sources leaked their deep disappointment with Italy's unilateral actions. NATO headquarters in Brussels went into crisis mode, with emergency meetings called to assess whether Italy's energy diplomacy constituted a breach of alliance solidarity. The carefully constructed Western United Front against Russian aggression was showing its first major crack. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from other EU member states facing similar energy crises. Polish government sources quietly expressed understanding for Italy's position, while Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban publicly praised Meloni's pragmatic leadership. More significantly, Czech Prime Minister Petr Fiala was reportedly overheard telling his energy minister to explore all available options following Italy's breakthrough. Even Slovak officials traditionally aligned with Brussels began making subtle inquiries about bilateral energy arrangements. The domino effect was already in motion, and European unity was fracturing along predictable fault lines of national self-interest versus ideological solidarity. The German response was particularly revealing. Chancellor Scholz's office issued a statement calling for dialogue and understanding, language that fell far short of the condemnation Brussels was expecting. German industry leaders were privately admitting that Italy's breakthrough might provide a template for their own energy security challenges. If Meloni could secure Russian gas without technically violating sanctions, perhaps Berlin could explore similar arrangements. The momentum shifted decisively when energy markets opened the following Monday. Italian energy companies saw their stock prices surge as investors priced in potential access to cheaper Russian gas. Meanwhile, Other European energy firms faced pressure as the possibility of Italy gaining a competitive advantage became apparent. The market was voting with its feet, and the verdict was clear. Meloni's gamble was working. Von der Leyen's response bordered on desperation. At an emergency European Council meeting, she demanded that Italy provide a full briefing on its Moscow communications. Meloni's representatives attended but offered only the barest minimum of information. They confirmed the call had taken place, acknowledged discussions about energy cooperation, but refused to elaborate on specific arrangements. The message was clear. Brussels could huff and puff, but Rome would determine its own energy destiny. The final nail in Brussels' coffin came from an unexpected source. Leaked documents from the European Council revealed that several member states had been conducting their own preliminary outreach to Moscow through unofficial channels. The Italian initiative hadn't just exposed the hypocrisy of European energy policy, it had given other countries permission to pursue their own national solutions. As the crisis entered its second week, the fundamental question remained unanswered. Had Giorgia Meloni just saved Italy from energy catastrophe, or had she delivered the first blow in the dismantling of European unity? The phone call that lasted less than 25 minutes had unleashed forces that would reshape continental politics for years to come. In the chess game of international relations, the Italian Prime Minister had just moved her queen to the center of the board, and Brussels was running out of pieces to respond. The silence from Moscow was equally telling. Putin's office offered no official comment on the conversation, but the Russian president's satisfaction was evident in his public appearances. He had successfully driven a wedge into European solidarity without firing a shot or moving a single tank. The phone call had accomplished what months of military pressure could not: the beginning of the end of Western unity against Russian influence.